he came back to me and said, well, I've spoken to the board of the local out here, and we will allow you to go into the union as an apprentice. And I said, you gotta be kidding. I said, look how bad this is gonna look in the trades.
Academy Award nominee going back
as an apprentice
okay.
Because you won't let him work. So they came back a second time and they said, okay, we'll let you into the union, but you cannot work. There was a Los Angeles roster, which I think still exists now. And the roster was very stringent then. It was run by the studios mostly. And the unions agreed to all the terms of it, and it worked in the union's favor because it saved their jobs and wouldn't allow outsiders to come in and do the work of their union members. And he said, we'll let you work out here and cut a feature film, but you cannot work for any of the studios with which we have an existing contract. You can only work on an independent movie if they haven't yet signed an IA contract.
Wow.
And so help me, someone was looking after me because I got lucky.
Was the 8-year rule still in effect at that time?
Oh, yes, it was.
And did you have to go through that 8-year rule?
No.
Do you guys know the 8-year rule back in the old days? Back in the old days? The 8-year where the assistant editor would have to work for 8 years before he would be eligible to edit a movie? And that was primarily to, I think it was, the editors just were protecting their jobs, right? I mean, that was primarily the reason.
Well, I think basically that was the reason. But they did have 3 grades of editors. You could go in as
3 grades.
Grade 1, 2, or 3, depending on the roster, depending on the number of years you had in. So they let me in as a grade 1, the lowest possible grade.
This was in New York or something?
No, this was here.
Los Angeles, okay.
As I said, I got very lucky, and I was offered a film to cut made by an independent studio that didn't have an existing contract with the unions out here. And they hadn't yet signed the contract, and the deal was if I went like a good little boy and went into it, they would in fact let me into the union, and I'd be sort of grandfathered into the union through the contract that they signed. So that was 81, I think.
81, you were, my God, you were so well established by 81. You had done some absolutely wonderful movies. You did The Rain People with Francis Coppola. You did Alice's Restaurant with Arthur Penn. You did Little Big Man. You did, oh my gosh, this, on and on. By the time of 81?
They were calling the ground rules.
All right.
And if I wanted to work here, that's what I had to do.
I think your life changed, at least in feature films, when you worked for Dede Allen.
Another one of the very lucky points in my life. I was at the right place at the right time and with the right credentials. She needed an assistant. I was there. I got the job. You
still made it kind of a mission to talk to her, even though when she was...
Well, I was working on her sound crew. Alan Heim was the supervising sound editor on the film, and I stepped backwards to take a job as a sound apprentice so I could make the move into features or get as close to them as I thought I could possibly get by being a sound apprentice. At the end of that film, the woman who was Dede's assistant and the young man who was her apprentice both decided not to continue on with her. So all of a sudden, miraculously, there was this opening. I asked for the job and I lobbied very hard for it. I pressed everyone I knew to call her. And she finally checked me out and said she would give it a shot. And then, behold, the union said no. The New York union said no. You haven't been an apprentice long enough. Luckily, once again, luck. The movie, Alice's Restaurant, was postponed. It was postponed for about 3 months, which miraculously took me to my 2-year minimum apprenticeship within the union. So I was able to call up the business agent and tell him where to stuff it.
What did you learn from Dede Allen?
I learned a lot about editing. I learned a lot about dealing with directors.
In a real-world situation, she's so busy editing. How does she find the time to actually spend any time with her assistant editors?
that was the great thing about it. It was the great thing about editing then on film, was that the first assistant was generally in with the editor and standing behind them all the time, handing them pieces of film. And you learned by watching, you learned by asking when it was appropriate to ask, and with someone like Dee Dee, you really learned because Dee Dee loved to talk, and she loved to explain things. She was a natural teacher, and she was great. She was great to be in the cutting room with. So that's how you learn. And besides that, she also would say, "Would you like to cut a scene?" "No, not me, no." Possibly. And when you would cut a scene, she would give you the footage. We'd screen it together, we'd make notes, and I would go off and neurotically stand at the moviola for days on end trying to finesse this piece. Then I would show it to her, and she was always great. She was always great because she was never really critical. She would say, "Did you ever think of trying it this way? Or did you ever think of trying it that way?" It was always a positive approach where you felt that you were part of the process, not that your work was being tossed out. And it was a great learning experience.
Well, the difficult thing about talking to editors is that we don't exactly know exactly what you do in the editing room. We don't know if you're the one responsible for this particular cut, or the director was, or the studio.
And I'm not going to tell you either.
That's the wonderful thing. We talk about great editors. Great editors are usually determined by great movies.
Yes.
By the material that you work on.
You know, if you went to Norman and said, "Norman, I'm thinking of hiring this person. Are they a great editor?" Well, I mean, I would assume that Norman would say, "Gee, I don't know the material they had to work with. If I knew the material, I could make a better judgment." But you're looking at a finished film. You don't know who made the decision. You don't know. You could sit there and say, "Oh, I wish they had gone to a close-up right there. That's where they should have gone to a close-up." But perhaps they had no close-up. Perhaps they had no coverage. So how do you judge an editor's work, in such an offhanded way? I don't know how you do it.
Because if you go to IMDb, Last Tycoon, Lies My Father Told Me, Godfather Part 2, Tough Guys, Serpico, Bang the Drum Slowly. He did from 1973 to 1976, he did those films. And then what did he do? Kojak.
Paying the rent, yes. You did. I know, right?
It's just, it's only been in probably the last 10 years or so that editors have become somewhat of a celebrity.
Well,
before then, you guys were really invisible.
I think that's true, and I think there was always more of a stigma in Hollywood about crossing between feature films and television than there ever was in New York. New York, a television series was bread and butter to an entire industry. And that wasn't the case in California. It was very divided here. You either worked in television or you worked in features, and in some ways it really still is. I think perhaps in the last 5 or 10 years there's more crossover, but still not a lot.
You worked on a lot of movies that had a lot of drama behind the scenes. The Godfather 2, Apocalypse Now had more drama in that. How long were you originally contracted for that movie?
I think it was supposed to go out there for 6 months.
And you were there for how long?
3 years.
There's a lot of mythology surrounding Apocalypse Now.
Most of it's true.
Okay. It was fraught with enormous amount of drama, not only delay after delay after delay, and cast changes and typhoons destroying the sets and unusable dialogue that came back to you. Were you there from day one of production, staying in San Francisco and getting the material? It was 230 hours total at the end of this whole thing. How did you manage all that stuff?
With difficulty.
Yeah.
I was not there from the very beginning. As a matter of fact, there were 2 other editors who started that job before me. I came on along with Jerry Greenberg. The sets had already been destroyed by a typhoon. I think it was probably about 6 months into the production. They rebuilt and they started shooting again. and finally finished the film. However, they finished the film with some things missing. The narrative that was the glue for the entire movie was never shot. And the decision was made to come back to the States, see what we had, and deal with that problem later.
The final product of Apocalypse Now, are you happy with it?
It's really hard for me to say. I think it's an incredibly ambitious movie. I think it has some brilliant work in it. I think it has flaws in it that we never completely solve, but it is a benchmark movie, certainly culturally in our time, as one of the first films to deal with Vietnam.
Every film you work in, every director that you work with is completely different, but a lot of the films that Richard Marx has worked on has been fraught with a lot of drama in the background. I mean,
I've been accused of being the source of it.
No, exactly. I mean, it really, we were talking about, Godfather 2, we got, Terms of Endearment with some couple of actors who didn't like each other and low-budget problems and things like that. You're aware of these problems, but does it affect you as an editor?
Sometimes if it's a particularly adversarial situation, of course it affects you as the editor. But generally, you close your doors. The great thing about the cutting room is you close the door, it's dark, and you work on the material. And hopefully you keep out as much politics as you possibly can.
For those out there who are directors and who want to communicate with their editors, can you give them any advice on how to communicate, or do you ever even listen?
Oh, no. I do listen, and I take what the director says very seriously. I like to screen dailies with the director, get their notes. It isn't necessarily what I will follow in putting together my first cut, but I like to know what the intent is behind the way something is shot or the way a performance is built. I think that's very important for the editor to do. I think as a director, you should let the editor do their first cut. It's hard because you're giving up your baby to someone else, and you're asking them to interpret something that you have a fixed idea of in your head. And I think it takes a very strong and a very smart director to take that kind of input.
Now, speaking of that first cut, do you always, depending on the director, and I'm assuming it's every director you work with, do you allow that, do you make sure that this scene plays before you show the director, or you just assemble it where the script says to assemble it?
No, I play with the scene. I make it work for me as best I can.
I mean, do you put temp music in there? You put special effects and sound?
No, I don't put special effects in. I do use sound effects at times. I do a lot of dialogue work when I'm doing a cut. I certainly put in sound effects, music occasionally, not often, because I think it, in some ways, for a first cut, it colors it in the wrong way. I think it's dangerous to do too much work and make it look like too finished a product.
Really?
Yeah, I really think you do, and I think it's one of the difficulties of electronic editing because it looks so smooth now. When you show a first cut of something, it looks so polished by nature. When we were cutting on film, you had shoe marks and cigarette ashes all over it, and it sort of looked worn. There's a danger in finessing it too much. As the editor, I think you have to make the scene play for you. And if it plays for you, then you should show it and start to get input.
Speaking of electronic editing, you were actually one of the first people to use electronic editing. You actually worked on the EditDroid, which is George Lucas.
I did it reluctantly, yes.
Yes, and I know you were one of the first people to use the Avid. You're not afraid of change?
No, I think at the point that I switched from film to digital, I sort of read the handwriting on the wall that if I didn't make that switch, I would no longer be cutting film, as they say. I had avoided using the Avid for years when it had been used on commercials and music videos because the storage, how much you could store and play back was a problem. Actually, one of the first films I cut on an Avid, I would have to, if we were playing back 2.5 hours of a cut, I would have to stop the machine so the sound would catch up with the picture. It was a hell of a way to watch a movie. But I think I correctly saw that it was time to make the change. And it was very difficult. There were a lot of people of my age or older that we drove out of the business because they didn't want to make the change. And it's a very awkward position to be in because most of what you do as an editor, the mechanics of what you do, just come so easily after years of repetition. And once you make the change, all of those, what you call instincts, you have to start thinking about. And instead of concentrating on the material, you start to concentrate on the mechanics of making the cut. And it's a very difficult transition.
But you got past that, obviously. I mean,
I did, indeed. And I mean, I enjoyed getting past it. I enjoyed the new tool.
Your relationship with Jim Brooks, how collaborative is that? Is he in the room all the time, or does he say, Richard, just give me the first cut and let's talk about it later?
He leaves me alone for the first cut unless there's a problem with a scene that we have to look at during shooting. But generally, he'll stay away till I'm ready to show him the first cut, which has traditionally been within 2 or 3 weeks of the finish of shooting. Only 40% of the work in the cutting room is actually cutting.
Really?
I think the rest is interpersonal relationships and being able to get along with people, get along with the directors, get along with anyone involved in the production. It is, in being a collaborative piece of work, making a film forces you to entertain the idea that you have to be able to collaborate with other people.
You've had a wonderful career.
I have.
I mean, you've had a wonderful career. And you've worked with wonderful directors, and you've worked on wonderful stories. We appreciate you taking the time to come to us.
Thank you.